I'm Ben, that's my audio, and I'm in Bendigo at Easter. Easter is a big deal in this town. Have a look at all the stuff we have on here.
It's not Easter till a fire truck's chasing you off the park in Roslyn Park. You've gone to the sort of market that your partner wants to take you to but never buys anything. The CFA collects money for the Children's Hospital at every set of traffic lights. That market goes on and is surprisingly large. Look, an armoured vehicle. This one's built in Bendigo. Still more interesting than that market. Might hang around and look at this for a bit. And more of that market. Wow, sure is big. Still haven't bought anything. Kids rides. Lots of kids rides. Market still goes on. It's actually divided in two parts here. Look, if you go in here, there's a second-hand book fair. It's pretty cool. More of that market, still haven't bought anything. Here's a dragon. We have a big dragon. And the market's still going. This is getting ridiculous. We have little dragons, night dragons, lions. More dragons. Full size, nighttime dragons. There's no show without bagpipes. Fireworks. Oh, it's just ridiculous, this market.
So the real question is, how did Imperial Dragons end up the heart of Bendigo's Easter celebrations? Well, let's have a look.
So the Chinese played a huge role in the early goldfields. Basically, thousands and thousands of them immigrated to the goldfields. It's thought in 1869 there were about 40,000 people of Chinese descent living in Victoria, in the colony of Victoria at the time. So that only made up about 7% of the total Victorian population, but on the goldfields it was a hugely high percentage because that's where they were heading. So in Bendigo and places like Ballarat, there were about a great big rat just walked past, never mind. They were about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of the population. Mount Alexander down the road at Castlemaine, they're actually 1 in 3 in 1959. So a significant percentage of the population. And because there were so many of them, and because they were culturally quite diverse from most of the other groups here, they could sort of keep their culture intact. There was certainly conflict between the European settlers here in Australia and the Chinese settlers as well. The colonial government tried to impose a tax to limit the number of Chinese coming into the country. It was so significant a tax that basically people were landing at Robe in South Australia and walking across the goldfields from there. It's 450 kilometres. No roads, no rail. You had to walk through old tracks and bits and pieces. So horrific way to get here, basically. Although a lot of people did it. There were things called roll-ups where Europeans would roll up their sleeves in the early days, chase the Chinese off goldfields they didn't want them on, productive land, etc. Most of that seemed to settle down after the 1850s, but there's still a bit of it, particularly in the early days when I don't think there was a lot of law enforcement on the goldfields. And I think tension remained there and always has been there in some parts of the community. Xenophobia is always a thing, right? But that integration's improved, and this whole Easter festival shows that, you know, there were certainly people who were prepared to give the Chinese a chance, and after all, to treasure their contribution, which is a beautiful thing. It makes you all warm and fuzzy inside, right? Most of the Chinese who came to the Victorian goldfields were Cantonese speakers, about 90% of them. So they came from what used to be called Canton, sort of Hong Kong province, to the sort of southeast of China. They, like I said, were here in a significant enough numbers that they could keep their culture more or less intact here in Australia. Now, the numbers peaked at about 1859, 1860. In the 1870s, a lot of them ended up moving back home to their villages and towns and cities in China. Some of them moved on to gold rushes in other places, particularly Queensland and to the Northern Territory to a lesser extent. But some stayed, and they made an ongoing contribution. They stayed in numbers in Bendigo that they kept that cultural identity. So there was a community, probably of about 15,000 people that lived where the munitions factory is now in Bendigo. And that was there as a community intact up until the next century. So there's not really many photos from the 1850s in Victoria, but we do have some sketches, and there's a guy, S.T. Gill, who travelled around the goldfields in the mid-1850s and sketched a lot of what he saw. And it seems he visited a Chinese restaurant, John Alu's restaurant, in Ballarat in the 1850s, and he's drawn the outside here. I love how he's had a go at sort of Chinese writing on the character there. Probably got it nothing right, but you get a feel for it. And the whole place looks really busy. He sketched the inside of it as well, and it looks chaotic. It looks really busy. People sitting on long benches next to each other. It's like some kind of alcohol on the left there, an ale or a cider. Part of the floor is dirt, part's wooden. People going back and forward and ordering. It looks quite a busy, popular place. It sort of gives that insight into the sort of idea that maybe most people were just too busy trying to get by, trying to make enough money to live. And it's a really cool sketch, I think. So the very first Easter procession happened in 1871, and it was designed to be a fundraiser for the Benevolent Society for the hospital. Remember, there was no state funding for hospitals at that time, so it was user pays plus fundraising that actually made those things happen. So this Easter procession moving forward was held annually to raise money to improve the hospital and to keep the hospital running. The very first Easter procession featured the Grand Marshal, Mr. John Stewart, Esquire. The Governor of Victoria attended and marched. The mayors of Sandhurst and Eaglehawk, members of the mining community, the Shire, the road sports, the hospital and the asylum communities, various societies, including St Andrew's Society, the Irish Australian Society, the German Society, the Grand Order of Oddfellows, etc., etc. There was a contingent of cavalry. The local fire brigades marched, and various pipe bands and pipers and other musicians attended and performed and marched. And right from the start, part of the point of the procession was to celebrate some of the diversity that contributed to the society on the goldfields. The very first Chinese dragon was one nicknamed the duck-billed dragon, was imported from southern China by the Bendigo Chinese community at their own cost, and participated in the Easter procession in 1892. It would continue into procession until 1898. In 1899, an interesting thing happened. There was a delegation from the Chinese community to the Easter Fair Committee who said, look, they couldn't put the dragon in this procession this year. They apologised. They said the condition of the dragon was such that it wasn't suitable for public display. They apologised, and they actually made a considerable donation to make up for the funding that was missed. The dragon was actually quite an attraction for the festival. A lot of people would come to see it by now, and it was sorely missed. There was a lot of comments in the paper. The community bought a whole new dragon, and it would appear in the 1900s. This is the moon-faced dragon, it's known as. The moon-faced dragon itself was a bit of a mystery because it was only around for a year, and then it disappeared, and no one knows what happened. It was replaced the next year with Bendigo's most famous dragon, Lung. Lung would feature in the Easter processions right through into 1970, and a bit like John Farnham, he had a couple of comeback tours and appearances right up into 2018 when he welcomed the new dragons and made his absolutely final appearance, so they say. He also was at the first Parliament of Australia in Melbourne, and he welcomed the Duke and Duchess of York when they visited in the early 1900s and appeared all over the colony. So one of the things I like about dragon, and I'm going to generalise a little bit, but there's an Eastern and a Western tradition of dragons, and on the whole, the dragons are sort of depicted kind of similar. They're reptilian-like animals. They can sometimes fly, they can breathe fire. blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is the Western dragons are very much sort of monstrous creatures to be feared, and they're kind of nasty. They're usually sort of in story, they're worthy opponents for our heroes to attack and kill and subdue. The Chinese view of dragons seems to be very different. They're much more benevolent creatures that bring luck and prosperity, and they're closely linked with imperial reign. So they're a very, very different tradition, I guess. So these guys are lions. They're sort of meant to represent a spiritual being rather than an actual lion, because they're not that close to an actual lion. They're always bundles of energy that, in the procession, precede the dragons. They're like puppies. They're sort of full of life and energy. So you've heard about Bendigo's past dragons? The duck-billed dragon, the moon-faced dragon, and Lung. Lung is actually just Cantonese for dragon, but that's what Westerners knew him as. So this is Sun Lung. Sun Lung took over from Lung in 1970 and was the main Easter processional dragon up into 2019. So in 2019, Sun Lung handed over to Dai Gong Lung, who is still our main processional dragon. And here he is, freshly emerging from the Dragon Museum to take his part in the Easter procession. And this is Yarlung. Yarlung is a special night dragon, and Yarlung means night dragon. He is actually the oldest of the dragons that still appear in the Easter procession, having first appeared in 1939. He was made in Hong Kong, and he's specially designed for nighttime presentation with his illuminated head and body. Yarlung only appears in the torchlight procession on Good Friday and not the normal parade on Easter Sunday. Yarlung was at some point damaged by a fire and almost destroyed, and he was found in the back of a warehouse somewhere. Don't know where the council keeps all this stuff, but the back of a warehouse somewhere, and was restored in the 1990s to return to processions, which is cool. So traditionally, dragons have to be woken up from their sleep to participate in processions. Not sure how it's done traditionally, but in Bendigo we try a whole number of things. We used to use bagpipes, now we seem to have politicians talking. We had a kung fu demonstration. There's never a bad time for kung fu, let's face it. We had lions dancing.
The dragon in a very special year.
Then more politicians speaking. I'm not really sure this is on par. It certainly wasn't keeping me awake, although they all spoke quite well, really. This is Mini Dragon. These guys came all the way from Darwin. Didn't really seem to help wake anything up either, but they were pretty cool. Then, after hours of presentation, and no, I'm not kidding, they had a whole bunch of lions come on, and they set off 200,000 firecrackers. So it certainly woke the bats up. Now, I remember as a kid, or I'm pretty sure I remember, that when they woke the dragon in the old days, they used to open the door of the museum, a dragon would stick its head out, look around, almost like, what on earth is going on, then go back inside. If you're listening, Chinese Association, bring that back. That's pretty cool to see as a kid. So the process of returning the dragon also involved lots of lions dancing, drums, and firecrackers. And it's quite complex to pack those things in there, so this does take a little while as well, but it's pretty cool. So the noise is gone, the streets returned to normal, but let's go have a look in the Chinese museum here because there's a couple of very special guests right in here. So in here we've got something very special. This is the retirement place for Lung. Lung gets to live in this museum. Traditionally, Chinese dragons were ceremonially burned when they finished. So he officially retired from Easter Processions in 1970, but he's made a number of appearances at important events since. He was president at the opening of the first Australian Parliament in Melbourne in 1901. They visited the Dutch and Duchess. And you can see he's very fragile, very old. He is, in fact, the oldest complete imperial dragon in the world, which makes him very special. So what I think is really cool about this whole thing is that we have a tradition that's partly Chinese and partly Western. We have an Easter procession where a dragon, a parade dragon, imperial trade dragon, performs. And it's not something that would be done in China because Easter's not a ceremony there and it's not part of that sort of celebration. It's not something we've done anywhere else. We've actually created a unique tradition that stood here for over a century and a half now. We've created a hybrid custom that we can actually call our own. It's Australian, it's not Chinese, and it's not European. And it's pretty cool. And the procession itself has sort of become a celebration of the diversity within our community a little bit as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed Bendigo Easter Dragons.
Great appearance.